We've reached the third phase of our Hermetic journey together, and this one today is on alchemy. We are going to break it up into two parts because the more I saw it, the more I got into it, the more I realized there's just so much. And plus, I want to try to make things more simple. The idea, I've had so many people say to me, why weren't they more clear? Why do they speak in mystery? Why do they speak in code? And I'm like, well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is because the ego doesn't understand the code. And so to get past the ego, we have to be able to talk in ways, almost poetic ways, to try to show through metaphor and parable what's really going on here, okay? So that's one. But the other is because people don't believe it anyways. I mean, Jesus straight up said, no, you're gods. You are the light of the world. I mean, he said directly, you're like equal with God. People still don't believe it. Most Christians would say that's heresy. Oh, I am God? No, just Jesus. No, Jesus said you could do greater works than me. The fact is that there's very clear spiritual teachings, like, love thy enemy, that people don't follow anyways, okay? So they can be clear as a bell, and they sometimes are. But why? Because we have to walk back the ego, all right? There's a lot of karma associated with the way we looked at the world, and we have to learn how to look at it differently. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into that, okay? And so as we dive into this process of alchemy and going through it, I have the 7 steps of alchemy up here, and you see that they're all rhyming words, and they're words that a lot of people might have heard of, but they don't really know what they are, okay? And like, what is conjunction? What is fermentation? What's coagulation, okay? So I'm going to do the same thing, make it a little bit more clear. Again, make it simple as much as I can. I also have rhyming words. I came up with other words for the alchemical process, other words that we're going to go through, just to make it more simple. And today's about looking at a broad overview of this process that we're all in together, okay? Because it's useful to know a little bit about this mystery that we're in. Imagine if you were pregnant and didn't know it. And what if you didn't know anything about pregnancy? All of a sudden, things start to change, your body starts to change, right? You don't know what's happening to you. That'd be quite awkward, wouldn't it? Right? Or imagine if you're trying to play golf and you don't know the rules of the game. Right? And you just go out there and you're just throwing the ball around, juggling, and then someone says, oh, the goal is to put that ball in the hole over there. So you go walk it down the fairway, you put it in the hole. Did I win? No, you have to use this club, okay? You have to hit it with the club. You can't use their hand. It's helpful to know the rules of the game. Well, what if it turns out we all are pregnant? What if it turns out we're pregnant with Christ? We're pregnant with Spirit, and we don't know it? That'd be awkward. And what if we're pregnant with Spirit, we don't know the rules of the game? Well, some of the 7 Hermetic principles we did last time help you with the rules, right? The Emerald Tablets give you a lot of wisdom about the rules. Now we're going to really go through the rules, at least the phases of the process that we're in. And you're going to see, because I directly link easier words or simpler words to try to understand it, make it more clear, but directly relating it to Christianity, okay? Because a lot of people think Hermeticism is blasphemy or it's a cult or something like that, right? I'm like, no, it's exactly the stuff Jesus was talking about too. I'm going to show you directly. And why it is your goal is to learn how to be the light. And whether you know it or not, that's what's happening to you. Okay? So we're going to go through it. I'm going to start with a couple quotes from Hermes himself, in which he says, if you do not make yourself equal to God, you cannot apprehend God. If you shut up your soul and your body and you say, I am afraid I cannot do this, then what have you a need for God? We don't have a God connection unless we put ourselves vibrationally on that level, or at least aspire to that. It's the whole point of all this, raising your vibration to the highest level of love. I always say it's really good therapy. It does heal our issues. It takes away addictions. It gets rid of mental health stuff. Whenever we love from the deepest of levels. Well, when the great prophets come around and tell us, like the Buddha, you are Buddha too, guess what? That's a high bar to clear, but clear it we must. And that's Hermes saying the same thing. You better put yourself on God's level or you're not going to have any connection to God. Then Hermes says, O ye earthborn folk. Okay, that's us people. Earthborn folk, ye who have given yourself to drunkenness. What do you think that means, drunkenness? Well, with the ego. We're drunk in our individuality, and we're drunk in how we're all so different. And we're not noticing the unity. Ye who have given yourself to drunkenness, be sober and cease to be glamored by irrational sleep. Glamored by irrational sleep. Like I say, almost every group these days, the word Buddha means to wake up. From what? The slumber that we're in. In the Bible, it says Adam was sent into a deep sleep. He never wakes up, not in the Old Testament. Jesus has to show up, the Christ, to help someone wake up. Resurrection is about waking up, okay? Raising people from the dead is about waking up. Breaking free from our irrational slumber. Why is it irrational? Well, it is really silly once you consider that the harm that we're doing, especially emotionally, is to ourselves. All our emotions come from our own brains. The way we look at the world, our perception is going to determine how we feel. As Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning said, he got through the Holocaust. It's not what happens to us, it's the story we tell ourselves about what happens to us. So we could settle into looking at the world physically, but that's fairly irrational. What's rational is to look at yourself as you actually are and look at the world through the lens of love only. From the God level perspective, known as agape, okay? That's rational. Why would we settle for less? And then we can really enjoy the world a lot more, okay? So we're going to go through the alchemy process. Now, what we're not going to talk about that so many people like to talk about, which is totally fine, is the chemical or scientific aspect of this. Turning lead into gold. Now, there are plenty of people who are interested in that. Have at it. There's millions of videos out there. Certainly a lot of books written on it too. Maybe it's quite interesting for some people. If you could turn lead into gold, you'd be pretty rich if you got yourself a lot of lead. But as most people who are in the spiritual disciplines are aware, that's not really what it's about. We're going to talk about the true aspect of what alchemy is. Turning a lower vibration into a higher vibration. Or ultimately turning the ego into spirit, okay? Turning the idea of the physical self into the true spiritual self. So it's a process. I have left Samadhi Lake up there, like I said. I've done that for a couple of months now, probably going to be up there all year. Why is it? Because the end result of the alchemy process is you find yourself in Samadhi, which is this lake the Buddha talked about. It's a state of mind, it's a state of being, and by the end of the alchemy process, you end up in that lake, okay? It's the kingdom of heaven, it's nirvana, it's Zen, it's all that stuff, okay? So we're going to leave that up there as a symbol of the interconnectivity of all things. So we're going to go through a quick drawing first, very simple drawing, to make this as simple as possible. Alchemy can get really deep, really scientific, really technical, words that maybe don't make that much sense, but we're going to make it nice and simple today. So I've got this simple 4-stage drawing. And here's the basic idea. Number 1, soul blob time. You are a conscious being. You are a soul, you are a spirit, whatever works for you. Imagine yourself as non-physical. That's what you are. You came to Earth, and here's your stick figure body. You have a body, and I've got the soul blob all sort of interwoven throughout you. It's like entangled around you. And it's hard to distinguish. You don't even know. It's so part of you, you think that what it is the ego. And so much of religion is done this way. I'm going to impress Big Daddy in the sky with my behaviors. Aren't I a good little boy? Now I get to go to heaven because I believe the right way. Right? Well, that's what this phase is. And that phase ain't going to cut it. Okay? Because that's the false self. That's a mistaken identity. It's the belief that the physical self is better than the spiritual self. It's false idol. And it's so interwoven into us that we can't even tell that it's there. Well, guess what? In order to get to the phase where we need to get to, we have to have some sort of experience which distinguishes between these two things. So you can have an awareness of your spiritual self and your physical self, your higher self and your lower self. There's a process that has to unfold so that you can now see the difference between these two things. Religion done badly is a bunch of people thinking they're going to impress God. Meanwhile, Jesus is saying, no, you're already forgiven. And Paul, it's only through grace that you're saved. Stop trying to do things to impress the Almighty Creator. All you have to do is realize that you are part and parcel of the Almighty Creator already. That's a pretty big hurdle to follow, to clear, especially if people have told you for thousands of years, this is the way you do it. Right? The way the church teaches oftentimes is actually stuff that Jesus himself left. He didn't want to be worried about or teaching physical laws. He came to fulfill those laws. That's why he didn't make things behavioral, as we'll talk in a minute. His one commandment wasn't a behavioral one, like thou shalt not kill. So we have to have this experience of some form of distinction between these two things so that we can now reintegrate. But I drew this very clearly like this on purpose. Instead of thinking, as we often do, that I have a body and my soul is in it, a good way to think of this is I am a soul and my body is in it. So I drew it like that, sort of like a memory or a dream. If we're sleeping, my soul is having a dream of Steve. And so it's more accurately put to put the body in the soul, not the soul in the body. It's not even specifically accurate because the soul is the body, ultimately. But to visualize the process and what this is all about is that you are an eternal spiritual being that's currently having a dream of your physical body. And I put some of the flesh stuff down here. So we stay grounded on earth. Like C.S. Lewis says, don't be so heavenly bound, you're no earthly good. In order to circle back around and learn how to love another as oneself, you better stay physically focused as well. And you'll see as we go through this isn't just about becoming spiritual all the time. There's an important distinction or important goal of being physical and spiritual at the same time. And that's also in this alchemy process, okay? So here we have the 7 stages of alchemy. Goes back thousands of years. It can be physical, and a lot of the stuff people try to do physically, and there is science to it, but I'm interested in the spiritual aspect of it. So as we go through them, again, I'm going to get deeper next lecture we do, but this one we're going to keep it nice and simple. The first phase of going from spiritual into confused, into distinction, into reintegration, the first phase that's necessary is called calcination. And it's basically when you get your butt kicked, okay? It's basically chaos. Bad stuff has to happen, a whole lot of it. Why? Calcination is the grinding process, all right, in which we're going to have to break apart that which is the physical and that which is the spiritual. We have to have an experience of that somehow. I call this phase endure the war, okay? What's the war? The war is the battle that's going on inside of you. The war is the battle that's happening in the physical world. What's the only thing you have to do? Because in this phase, it's phase 1. You're not getting to this phase quickly. The first thing you have to do is endure it. Hang in there. Develop some level of trust, okay? Have some experience in the system that the system is there for a purpose and there's a reason behind it. It is the emphasis on everything happens for a reason. And so what we call bad stuff, like it says in the Bible, don't eat off that tree. There's nothing bad. The Buddha said, no bad nor good, just peace and not peace. So bad stuff happens, air quotes. Endure it. This is the no pain, no gain phase, okay? You're going to have pain. No one breaks free from this and gets into the deeper phases without going through the pain. It's going to happen, and it's the Buddha's first noble truth, which is, you're here, you're going to suffer. Suffering will happen. And now we don't have to have any concern about whether or not it's fair, because everyone goes through it. You're going to suffer, endure it, that's your job. Okay? Now, endure the war. It's going to happen. You're going to experience it. Here's Galatians 2:20, when Apostle Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. What's a crucifixion? That's pretty painful, isn't it? Paul went through it. And then Paul's trying to teach people, guess what? We're going to go through it. Jesus says, pick up your cross and carry it. We're all going to go through it. You're going to have pain. You're going to suffer. Now, Paul and Jesus both referred to this as childbirth. Remember, we're pregnant with spirit. John 16:21-22, Jesus says, whenever a woman is in labor and she has pain, because her hour has come, that's why she has pain. When she gives birth to her child, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy that the child has been born into the world. Therefore, you too have grief now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. Because we're pregnant with spirit, we have to give birth to it. It's going to be painful. It's difficult, but what's experiencing the pain? The ego. The thing that you think you are but aren't, the thing you are temporarily, that's having all the pain. And it's going to go through pain. And Paul says in Galatians 4:19, I like to call it the spiritual obstetrician, I am with you, children, in childbirth. I'm again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. So Paul knew that Christ was in everyone. He said the mystery is Christ is in us. And to watch someone go through it can be painful. It's teamwork stuff. And he knew what to look for. He knew the process. I don't know if he knew alchemy, but we're going to go through the process. And it is a painful process, right? So no pain, no gain. Embrace the pain and you'll win the game. Okay? That's the goal. We have to embrace that. And then to do that the correct way, when you endure, we'll flip you into stage 2. It's called dissolution. I call this phase ignore, just rhyming with endure. Ignore. What am I supposed to ignore? Ignore the boar. You know what a boar is? B-O-A-R. It's a pig. Don't cast pearls before swine, says Jesus. Well, what's the pig or the swine inside of all of us? No offense to little piglets. It's the ego. It's the being that rolls around in the mud, okay? We have to learn how to ignore that thing, because what is dissolution? Dissolution is when emotions overwhelm us. We just went through a bunch of bad stuff. We just went through a bunch of chaos. Now we are in this phase of dissolution. Now we're left with all these emotions and all these thoughts. These are experiences that, again, everyone has. But what's happening is here, you're learning how to break up the eternal self and the temporary self to see them distinctly different. And that requires this phase where you go through all this emotion and all these thoughts, and we get disturbed by it. But once you know that what you're supposed to do is give birth to your spirit, that's the end game here. Now you have to pay attention to those voices inside your head. Because little do we know there's a spiritual voice, this still small voice, that's always been there trying to speak to you. But that ego is so loud, it's a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. It's banging in your head all the time. This is bad, this is good, and this is the way things should be. And it's attachment, it's all this physical world stuff, and it's the reason for suffering. Well, that's a boar, it's a little pig, it's a swine, ignore it. I like to think of my favorite movie, Revolver, in the elevator scene, when Guy Ritchie's character, Jason Statham, is having really his awakening experience. And he hears that ego, it's yelling at him from inside his own head, and he whispers to it, shh, 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 shh. I can hear you, he says, right? He says, I'm on to you. You don't control me, I control you. Because when we know that the pain is happening, we know there's going to be a voice saying, I don't like this, I wish it wasn't going to happen, this is unfair, right? When we throw our little temper tantrums, Sadhguru says, look at you getting all caught up in your drama. Okay, this is all of us. Course in Miracles says the secret to salvation is this. You're doing this to yourself. Because until we learn how to calm that voice, quiet that voice, we're going to stay stuck in this phase. In a little bit, we'll talk about what that word is over here. But this is a loop. We're going to keep going around and round and round again in this pain until we learn how to trust the pain. Ignore the ego. I also put the word bore, B-O-R-E, because the ego is boring after a while. There's an exhilarating voice inside of you, the spiritual voice. It's why Jesus said, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways are higher than your ways. That's exhilarating. The spiritual journey is exhilarating. You want to stay stuck in these two steps? You're going to keep looping around and round again until you learn how to say, I'm not going to listen to you, ego voice, anymore. I'm going to learn how to listen to that other voice. In a word, that's trust. In a word, it's able to say, I don't like what's happening to me, but I trust. This is where everything happens for a reason. Things don't happen to get you a better job or a better relationship or a new house. That's not why things happen. Mm-hmm. Things happen so you can have a distinct spiritual experience. Things happen so you can learn how to differentiate between the ego voice in your head and the spiritual voice. Which leads us to 3, separation. Now in separation, we're getting to this phase. Separation is you can start to see the difference between the temporary self and the eternal self, the higher self and the lower self, right? The polarity that we talked about in the Hermetic principles. You have a higher self and a lower self. You're just one self, but like it says in the Bhagavad Gita, there's a capital S and a small s. One's eternal and one's temporary. Well, the separation phase, I call it therefore, to continue the rhyme, endure, ignore, therefore, because it's philosophical in a way. I like to think of it as intellectual enlightenment. You're not done yet, but you now get it. You're like, I see. I'm not a physical being like I thought I was. You have a distinction. You just went through the trusting of the emotion phase, which, by the way, I like to call the GPS. When I work with addiction, I say, don't keep covering up your GPS with drugs and alcohol. You have to listen to your emotions. And as you listen to your emotions, they guide you to where you need to go. Well, they guide you to separation. Therefore, and I have, continuing the rhyme, and or, it's yin and yang. Am I my higher self and my lower self? Or am I higher self or my lower self? And most of us operate in the or as the lower self most of the time. But then sometimes we get too spiritual, end up in a cult because we're working on being the higher self. That's also or. Guess what we need to do? We have to do the and. So therefore and or, it's a philosophical phase in many ways. You just got through really challenging experiences, could be considered dark night of the soul. We're going to do that next week in terms of lived experience, what it looks like to go through this stuff. But once you get through and endure and you ignore that ego voice, now you can sit back and be philosophical. Now, I want to jump back in the ignore phase. How do you break free from the suffering? Well, Jesus had one commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's how you do it. Every aspect of your being, love it. Don't just pick and choose. I love this guy, but not that guy. I love this circumstance, not that one. Love all of it with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That'll shut up the ego real quick. Because the ego wants to say good and bad, better than, worse than, inferior, superior. That's what it wants to do. But if you just love it all, it's going to get diminished pretty quickly. So, Matthew 13:16, Jesus says in the separation phase, here we have, blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Because now we have a distinction. The separation phase is a distinction. Now you can go, oh, I get it. I have a physical self, and I have a spiritual self. They both have bodies. Spiritual body, physical body. And now I can start to get some of the metaphor and the parables of what we're talking about when he refers to fish and walking on water and resurrection and all that stuff. Now you're able to sit back and go, I think, therefore I am. I'm able to pay attention using my mind to distinguish the difference between these things. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear, is super important because Jesus is talking to a specific group of people who've gotten to this phase. Again, I don't know if he knew about alchemy. It doesn't matter from his perspective. He taught the same stuff. If you see that you're a spiritual being and that's who he's talking to, your spirit, not your body, now the Bible's going to make much more sense. It's not about telling other people what to do physically. It's about forgiving and mercy and kindness and compassion and all those virtues. Not about behaviors. So, therefore, and/or ends up in this idea of, oh, I can see clearly now. That reminds me of the, what was his name? Johnny Nash, right? Johnny Nash. I can see clearly now, the rain is gone. That's this phase. Here was the rain, now it's gone. And that shifts us into one of the more pleasant phases, because there's adversity in most of this, but conjunction phase. This is the phase when it starts to get a little pleasant. I like to call it your freshman year. It's your rookie year. You now realize I'm a spiritual being and a physical being, okay? Conjunction is exploring. I have explore before you get into the heavier stuff, because now you're a freshman in high school, freshman in college. It's fun. It's a new adventure. You now realize you're a spiritual being, and now you've taken on this, responsibility of what I need to do. I have to give birth to my spirit at some point, right? I'm going to have to integrate and get into this. Well, this phase here, which is a more pleasant phase, it's like you graduated to some extent. You don't have to go through this hell like Izzy did before, but you get to this phase, now go exploring. What does Jesus say in Mark 12:17? That is where he says, render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's. He's now distinguishing between what was physical and what is spiritual. This is the duality phase. It's and or. You're both. Do your physical stuff. Keep doing that. Make sure you eat and get some good sleep and pay your taxes, I guess. That was what he was talking about. But do the spiritual stuff too. Do the virtues. Make sure you work on your spiritual muscles as well. That's this phase, and that's Mark 12:17. If you do that correctly, it gets you into fermentation. Now this one, again, we're going to go much deeper into these three things next week. But the fermentation here is the phase in which it's not enough just to get to this point where you realize you're a spiritual being. Remember, Jesus had 2 commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love another as oneself. It's how we get the whole world to wake up together. Where would I be if a bunch of people didn't before me help do all this stuff so I could learn all this stuff and get to practicing on it, right? Where would we be? Thank goodness there were people for thousands of years working on this stuff. Made it a lot easier for us, right? Thank you to all of them. But thank you to all of us, because we're working on it together right now. Just getting to that phase isn't enough. That's like going, I have to climb that mountain. Nah, that's enough. No. Now you got to climb the mountain. So that's where fermentation shows up. And here, explore into implore. Now, to implore is to have a passion for, to really urge on, someone. Well, inside of yourself, I'm calling this sophomore, because it rhymes with implore. You go from freshman into your sophomore year, here's junior, senior. Implore in your inner sophomore, because look, I got a couple years to go, maybe a couple lifetimes, before I get there. It becomes the slow burn. Here it was fire, right? You were getting your butt kicked by the universe and experiences, right? Bunch of chaos happened to you. That's addiction, and that's job loss and relationship stress and disease and all that kind of stuff, right? Tragic death, boom, it's all over the place, right? Well, here it reminds you of this. It's a bit of an echo, but it's a slow burn that comes from inside you, because you know what you have to do now. You're starting to get mature. You're like, oh boy, I better graduate. You don't need to go through that all again, unless you do. Again, we're going to end on that word. But you don't have to go back there, as long as you keep the slow burn going. I like to think of it as simmering, right, or sautéing. You just did a lot of work to get to this phase where you're fermenting. James 2:17. Faith by itself, without works, is dead. So you get to this place where like, oh, it's a spiritual place, okay? We're just spiritual beings having a physical experience. Nope, not enough. Faith without works is dead, which means now you have to put it into play. Don't just go join a cult or off yourself or whatever. No. You now have to learn how to integrate. It's ultimately what I'd like to call in an earlier video a couple years ago, art class. This is a project we're all doing together. We're creating some work of art. And we're going to end with that work of art, talking about that. You didn't come here just to wake up. You came here to wake up and then live as a physical being. That's why I drew it like this, okay? It's not enough just to go be spiritual. Now go spiritual and physical, which means we have to reintegrate. We have to bring that which is spiritual back into the physical. This whole phase, these three phases, is why Jesus in the Lord's Prayer says, on earth as it is in heaven, right? God's will brought into earth, as it says in the Tao Te Ching. Can you play the feminine role and bring the Tao to earth? Well, that's this. Fermentation is the next level challenge. You're now getting to be mature, but it's a whole bunch of different stuff that starts to happen to you. In many ways, it's really, really annoying. Again, next week we're going to get into the practical examples of this. But it's annoying, and in some ways it adds up to the pain of this. But it's not nearly as intense for a bunch of different reasons. Mostly because you have clarity. It's like when a woman is in the 9th month, right? It's a lot of different stuff going on there, but at least they know they're getting close to the end. Here we're getting close to the end. So implore, as a sophomore, you're going to have to do some work. It's not just sitting around becoming awake and aware. I also like to call it, this is where we're adulting. You started out as a spiritual kindergartner, but now you get to this point, and guess what? You got to put on your big boy pants and get to work. That's not enough. We got some more work to do. Which flips us into distillation. Now, here's a verse from the Tao Te Ching. Now, I call distillation restore. Psalm 23 says that your soul is going to be restored. Restoration is what we're talking about, bringing your soul back into this whole system, okay? But a verse from the Tao Te Ching says this: a leader is best when people barely know that he even exists. When his work is done, his aim is fulfilled, and they will say, we did it ourselves. That's good leadership. Now, the ego wants to take credit for things, right? I'm the coach. I'm the guy that led these people to this place, okay? Spirit doesn't care. The Tao's filled with this kind of teaching. Look what Jesus did. What a great leader, and he let himself get killed at 33. Was he being arrogant? Muhammad didn't even want his picture shown anywhere. He didn't want to be known as the guy that brought the Quran or the truth to earth. Ego isn't interested in taking credit. This is the phase of spiritual maturity. So we have restore, mature, rapport, and mentor. Okay? It's all those things. It's a phase of spiritual maturity. It's your junior year. Okay? Getting close. But what does this mean? This is the phase in which you better have harmony with other beings. You know that you're supposed to work on this dynamic in order to get to this place. It's not about a selfish act of doing it by yourself. It's about joining with every other being right where they're at. It's a leadership phase. And it's a looking at each other person, like we did in the Eightfold Path. Each other person also, through right intention, has the ability to learn the Eightfold Path. It's not enough just to make people's lives physically better. We have to help them along spiritually. That's what this phase is. And perhaps my favorite of all the scriptures, I repeat it so often, Luke 12:47. Here's where, if you know your master's will and you do not make ready according to his will, you will receive a severe beating. You get to this phase of development and you regress it all and think you're superior, you're better than those kindergartners, or you don't love people as your enemies right where they're at, you're going to get a severe beating. Encore. You're going to do it again, okay? Don't regress. Don't go back. You know better. If you know your master's will, you don't make ready, you'll receive a severe beating. If you don't know his will, up here, and you do what deserves a beating, your beating will be less severe. Because kindergartners don't have the same level of expectation that juniors in college do, okay? For those to whom much has been given, much is expected. And for those who men have committed much, they will demand more. Now again, next week, the energy of this, the emotion of this, the holding space, the safe space of this is what it's all about. we better be able to be present with people when they're experiencing these phases, okay? Our job, what gets you to the 7th stage, is to be able to be present with the rest of the world when they're going through the war. Quite literally sometimes going through the war. In the United States, going through a political chaos, the political season that we're in. You better be able to see all our presidential candidates as equals, spiritually speaking, right? Can't be done physically, but you don't have to do it physically. Do it spiritually. That's going to help you mature, develop a rapport, and be a good mentor, right? Now, distillation is the word they have for it. We'll do more of that, a little bit more of that next week as well. But just think in terms of restore. I've now restored my soul. What I've now done is I've gone through this process, including the separation process, and I get into fermentation. I start to develop the spiritual awareness, and then boom, all of a sudden I've restored my soul. But now I have a physical experience inside my spiritual self. This is also the place where the spirit gets released naturally, as Rumi talks about with a rose that blooms, a fragrance gets released. He says, what is said to the rose to make it bloom is said to me in my heart. All you have to do is get to a phase. Into this phase, spirit just comes off of you naturally. Listen, you're not special. Roses all release fragrance. No big deal. They bragging. I smell better than you. Everybody's going to get to this phase. All right? No one's special. As it says in Course in Miracles, no one's special. We're all unique. That's true. But inside each little being, each one of us is this process. It's going to happen. You can identify where you're at, perhaps. That's helpful. Now you can know what's coming next. But mature we better be. And Paul says we have to move beyond the elementary teachings of Christ into maturity. Well, now we've moved into maturity, which flips us into the last stage. Guess what? All good. Kingdom of Heaven stage, okay? Called coagulation. I just continue my rhyme by saying galore. What kind of galore? Now pretend for a minute that in Italian, A-M-O-R-E is pronounced amor, okay? Because it means love, right? Amore. But galore, amor, lots of love, great amounts of love galore. Or adore, that works too. Because now it's an experience that you're having that you can adore. That it's not just this hell on earth, because that it was for a while. But this is what's promised to us. This is the kingdom of heaven and Noah's Ark. We'll talk about that next week as well. And how Noah's Ark fits into all this stuff. The end game of Noah's Ark, guess what? Don't have to go through it again. Once you get to this phase, you're deep in a phase in which now, guess what? You are officially born again. Now we've got John 3:3-6. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? This is the way a lot of people look at religion, like Nicodemus here, taking it literally. Born again, Jesus. What does Jesus say? Jesus said, truly I say to you, unless you are born of water and of spirit, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. That which is born of flesh is flesh. That which is born of spirit is spirit. It makes the distinction quite simply, okay? That's the phase we're in here. Now you're born again as spirit. And what does Paul say in Ephesians 2:10? We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. It means art class, okay? We were sent here to do some creative spiritual work. And it's interesting. Jesus sure got an A+ on his final, right? I would say all the prophets did a wonderful job with their great works that they did. They didn't want to take credit. They just donated back to the earthlings. These earth beings who are all asleep in their slumber. They did great work, art projects. That's us. We have art projects, whether it's music or writing or poetry or culinary skills or just relationship skills, counselors, teachers, all throughout the world, workers at Sheets, okay? I gain a lot from them when they look you in the eyes and they have compassion. It doesn't matter. Like Rumi says, you're only created to do one thing, not to be a doctor or a lawyer. You were created to get back in touch with your divinity. And that's this phase. Love galore. Lots of stuff to adore here, okay? And now you have a chance, because you are now spiritually integrated into the physical. You still have your ego, but it's secondary. Now you can go do fun stuff. You can appreciate the rest of the world. You will adore it, in fact. When this phase comes about, the rainbow shows up, and we have this promise from the beyond, hey, you don't have to go through it again. Unless, the last rhyme, unless you do have to do it again, encore. Do you want to do it again? Well, you don't have to address any of this. That's why we have multiple eyes. right? The ego, recognizes, oh, I don't want to do that again. But the spirit, guess what? I'm just going to keep going until I get it done. If I have to learn 10 more lives, I have to go through 10 more lives, okay? Hindu teaching on the 2 students with the guru. Guru, how many lifetimes do I have left? The first student said. The guru said, you have 4 lifetimes left. And he stamped his feet and he walked away. Second student says, Guru, how many lifetimes do I have left? And the guru said, you have 16 lifetimes left. And the student said, okay. In that moment, heaven opened up and they plucked the student right up in heaven. Because if you could accept that process, boom, you're going to advance quickly. We don't need to worry about future lives and past lives. We just have to worry about right now. Be here now, right? Right now is the process we can experience this. But in every step of the way, if we resist, here's where you have all the wonderful Taoist teachings. Go with the flow. If we resist any of these phases and we don't trust and we don't love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, encore, we get to do it again. And you could repeat any of these phases again. You could go through all of them again if you regress at any point just by refusing to advance. That's what it means. You're not going to forget what you learned. But if you refuse to love another as oneself, right, or resist your emotional state along the way, or decide to just go be spiritual all the time, not physical. I mean, there's so many examples of it. You can repeat. Encore. And this phase in particular, as we already said, who wants to go through the pain and suffering over and over and over again? Just learn how to wake up. Join with each other on it, right? Practice the very specific spiritual teachings in Christianity. Forgive each other, right? Love our enemies. Be hopeful and faithful and all that stuff, and then put it into work. If you don't do it, we have an encore. But if you do it the right way, we go from enduring to ignoring to thereforeing, exploring, imploring, restoring, and galoring. And that's the end game, right? Next time we talk, we're going to go through this stuff in more detail, but the broad overview is that it's going to end up with lots of love.